I'm Lacey Bresky. I'm joined by my friends and fellow international affairs colleagues, Drew Casey.
Hey.
And Kevin Ferdosi.
Hello.
Today we'll be discussing the phenomena of sinking states. With sea levels rising around the globe, many countries and islands are facing a very grim future. After we discuss this, we'll bring Grace Chesson into the mix to give us a positive look at this topic for the future. So, we're talking about states that are literally sinking. What states are being affected?
Yeah, so there are quite a few that are being affected. There are the so-called SIDS nations, the small island developing states, like Nauru, Tuvalu, but then they're also
big ones, right?
They're also big ones. I don't know if you would say that they're sinking, but they're definitely being affected by rising sea levels. Australia is, Maldives, of course. Bangladesh is a big one.
So what is happening? What kind of time frame are we looking at before some of these nations start to disappear?
That depends on the nation itself. So sea levels are will be rising anywhere from 3 to 6 feet, depending on where, over the next 40 to 50 years. And again, I think this rate and that amount can shift over time as new data is collected. So I think to start the conversation off, the most important thing to keep in mind is that sea level rising as a result of global climate change is not a straight line moving in any direction. It is shiftable, and that will depend on increases or decreases in the factors that are causing global climate change as a system.
Just to give you an idea of how some of these different states will be affected, the Maldives are about 1.5 meters above sea level on average, which is nothing. And the president of Kiribati has said that by 2030, the island will start disappearing. And he thinks that within 30 years, the island will be gone.
So, the other thing I think we need to focus on is who's at fault for this. I mean, greenhouse gases are seen as largely the biggest culprit behind this, and most of CO2 falls into that category. Burning fossil fuels for energy, like many emerging economies and large nations, is also putting these small nations at a risk of extinction, right?
Yeah, it is. Well, I mean, if you're asking who's at fault for this, I think different actors within the global system have different proportions of contribution to greenhouse emissions, CO2 emissions, that are contributing to this issue. The ones that are always talked about and mentioned, certainly, which have the largest total emissions and per capita emissions, China, the United States, the European Union as a political and economic bloc, and then India, Russian Federation. So you have, like kind of a mix of developed, right, and developing areas and states that are contributing to this issue.
I agree, and I think one of the hard parts is, and it's a frequently discussed topic, is, where do you set the blame? Because for these developed nations, it's hard to put the blame on the developing nations because Western nations practice these same methods beforehand. So really,
Right, and have already gone through it.
Exactly.
And owe a lot of their success to the CO2 emissions. Yeah, that's true. I think that is true. I would also argue, though, that, we know a lot more about climate change now than we used to. We should also say, though, this is somewhat a partisan issue. I think what's undeniable is the fact that the climate is changing.
Sea levels are rising.
Global warming, or as some climate scientists put it, global weirding is real. The question is, how much is it due to man-made, or how much of it is anthropogenic?
Absolutely.
What is global weirding? Is that different from global warming? Is that a nuance?
So I think global weirding is really just a more accurate term because, was it Senator Inhofe who came on the Senate floor with a snowball and was like, this is proof that the...
Multiple times.
Multiple times? Okay, I thought it was only once.
No, unfortunately, it happened more than once.
Got a track record of that.
Okay, so yeah, this guy comes out and says, look, I got a snowball in my hand. Global warming is not real, right? Hilarious video. We'll put that in our show notes. But the truth is that climate change is not just a warming, although it is overall warming, but it's causing, things like increased natural disasters, hurricanes, hotter summers, colder winters. So
you're seeing extremes on both sides of the scale.
Yeah, so that's why some people are calling it global weirding, because it's all kinds of craziness happening.
So can we still put the blame on bigger nations? Should this be a concern for these larger economies and larger emitters?
I think there's a number of ways to go about this. Certainly, a lot of the states that will be most affected by this, by global weirding, are not the greatest contributors by far to the issue. And so they rightfully feel like the largest contributors, which are typically are the more developed and the faster developing nations, which have a lot more heft than they do, and potentially a lot less at stake, that those nations should take leadership roles to cap their own emissions, or to put in place and self-enforce policies to sort of combat this problem. I think certainly the economic power and resources afforded to a lot of these states, the United States in particular, and also the European Union, by the same trends that also produced their greater contributions to climate change, can be more effectively thrown into innovation, right? For how do you restructure your economy? How do you restructure your energy infrastructure in such a way that emissions are reduced and the effect of economic growth is not as harmful to the global environment, and then also not as harmful to these other smaller countries who, frankly, this is not an economic threat to them. This is an existential threat to them, right? So I think these larger nations owe the global community their expertise, their experience, and their wealth to innovate and find more solutions than we have right now.
Right. I mean, if we accept, as I think most of us do, and most of the scientific community does, that man-made, or that this is to a large extent man-made, if we accept that, then you have to put the blame on the states that are the largest emitters, right? Because states like Bangladesh or Tuvalu, who are the most affected, I mean, if you tell them to cut their emissions, that's not going to do anything.
It's not enough.
I mean, small islands, the small island states, they put a fraction of 1% of the CO2 in the environment. So you look at China, the United States, the European Union, those are the ones who are putting the most CO2 into the atmosphere. So those are the ones that really need to make the biggest changes.
I think what will be critical for that as well, and maybe I'm partial to this, to focusing on this, but I think the U.S.-China relationship in the climate change arena will be critical for this. Like I said, both of them are both the United States and China are major contributors to climate change, major contributors to CO2 emissions. China has made the argument. Now, they have recently reached an agreement that they will, maybe this time around, they will do some cap and trade of emissions and whatever. I'm not sure that China is capable of following through with that, or willing to. I don't know enough about the details of it to know what the loopholes are. Although I do know that the rhetoric has been such that China has placed the United States in a position of blame for its own emissions by saying that U.S. investment-led growth in China, our factories in China essentially, that is allowing them to grow and allowing us to remain prosperous, are the reason that they are the most one of the more polluted countries in the world and contribute a significant proportion of the world's CO2 emissions. So that's going to be a difficult rhetorical iceberg to melt.
I for one am going to be a little bit optimistic. I think that because China, they're in a situation where they really need to change something, right? I mean, the cities are so polluted. You're looking at people who are going to start. I mean, this could start an uprising, really.
They're extremely hazardous cities and negative health effects.
Exactly. And, people can't put up with that forever. I mean, literally, I don't even know the numbers of how many people die in China because of the atmosphere there. It's exorbitant. So I think that the fact that their cities are so terribly affected, they really do have to do something about it. Having said that, even if China cuts their CO2 emissions in half, they're still emitting more CO2 than all of the European Union. So you're in a situation where you have states, I mean, China and the U.S. are the largest contributors, but no matter what we do, you're still going to be putting in a lot of CO2, and until you're at zero, you're still pumping more into the environment, and that's
just
still
creating,
just
exactly. Piling it on, exactly. So let's go into what's going to actually happen to these sinking states. I mean, we're looking at severe security issues, including climate refugees. So what's going to happen? Where are these people going to go?
I think that remains to be seen, and it depends on what country you're talking about, and it depends on what their foreign relations looks like. I think, Kevin, you were talking about Kiribati believes Kiribati seems to be one of the most drastic cases, and also the Kiribati government has created, what's the population of Kiribati?
About 100,000.
About 100,000. Okay, so that's a lot of people. And Kevin, take over for me here about Kiribati.
So the president of Kiribati has said that he believes that the island is going to go completely underwater in the next 30 to 50 years. And that's 100,000 people who are going to need a place to live, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's a pretty big number. He's actively looking, or was actively looking last I checked, for places where the rest of the population could move. They bought 6,000 acres in Fiji for natural resources, right, like food, but also potential resettling. And then you look at the Maldives. The Maldives is even closer to the sea level, and their population is 300,000.
Have the Maldives made inroads at looking at resettlement for themselves?
The previous president in 2011 created a sovereign wealth fund to begin raising money to purchase land somewhere else to move the population wholesale. They looked at India. They looked at Sri Lanka. An interesting case interestingly with the Maldives, though, that president was ousted by the military for failing to protect the name of Islam. Okay, so what we have here is also a situation in which internal political instability can hinder the ability of the government in the Maldives or in other countries as well. We won't look at all of their internal political instabilities to find a solution to the problem of this existential threat that they have. Rising sea levels is encroaching upon their territory.
So what happens when these states actually do go under and become, pun intended, dissolved states? What do we have as far as these people, first of all, are completely displaced, but also do these people become members of other countries? I mean, will other countries take them in like refugees?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question. I believe that this is going to be a huge issue in the next 30 years, where we're going to start seeing climate refugees. And already you've had some people applying for asylum in countries as climate refugees. New Zealand, I know they've had a couple of cases that were in the news. One of them they rejected, but I think that they had one from Tuvalu, a family from Tuvalu that they accepted as refugees, partially based on the climate problem there. So right now, it's a trickling effect where
we're going to see a trend, though, and probably an upsurge in this.
Almost inevitably, unless the oceans start retracting, right? which isn't
very
the trend,
unlikely. Yeah.
Right? So yeah, I think in the next 20, 30 years, especially for the SIDS countries, where the entire island may vanish, and then also in countries like Bangladesh, where you have a lot of the population right along the coast. Nauru is only habitable along the coast. I think their population's around 10,000, though. That's not a whole lot, but still, these are people who are going to have to go somewhere. And, I think that you will see a lot of refugees, and eventually someone's going to have to take them in.
An interesting thing about this, though, is that climate change can be contributing to a decrease in a state's territory, but in some cases, and this will depend on the local geology of the states, which we're not going to get really heavy into, but it's important to note that in some cases, states are gaining territory because of climate change. So one example is Tuvalu. The majority of the population of Tuvalu lives on the main island of Fongafale, which is essentially it's an atoll. So it's a thin island that sort of loops around a lagoon. And if you were to look at a picture of this, essentially it's just a big sea, right? And so it's one strip of land, one spit that kind of just loops around a lagoon that is larger in area than the land that it's on. Now, what's important to note about Tuvalu and about this island of Tuvalu in particular is that it is a coral reef island, which means that its territory, it's constantly sort of shifting, and that's just the way that coral reefs are. So rising sea levels will erode this coral on one side of the atoll, but then it will also compact and expand coral material on the other side of the atoll. So essentially, the
land they're losing is land they're gaining. True,
potentially right, and these aren't necessarily happening at the same rate.
Sure.
So in some cases, the land area is actually expanding. So for example, there's a great National Geographic article that we will post up on the website talking about this particular issue, which has some really interesting statistics. One of which is some of the islands in Tuvalu have grown by as many as 14 acres within the past 10 years. And then the main atoll, Funafuti, has gained 75 acres over the past century. And then some of their islands have even shifted entirely, some by as many as 300 feet over the last 40 years from their original location. So this is not just a case of islands are sinking. This is also a case of land area is shifting. That can still be a problem if you have infrastructure. Your road will crumble out.
Exactly. And we can't necessarily count on that for many states. I mean, this is, I think, by far an exception to the vast majority of states that are actually losing land at a pretty hefty pace.
I don't remember what the altitude of Tuvalu is, but 5 feet. Okay, so I mean, it won't last forever.
No. So I think the last question that we need to sort of cover is what can we do to stop this? I mean, what are we going to do apart from the inevitable fact that states will dissolve and that there will be climate refugees who will need to be taken in?
I think some countries who have the resources are building walls, right? Italy's building walls to keep water out, but they have the resources. Countries like Tuvalu that are the most in danger, Tuvalu's GDP is $38 million. So, I mean, what are you can't build a wall. I think that the wall in Italy is hundreds of millions of dollars. $38 million is the GDP of Tuvalu. That's 105 Tuvalus to one Donald Trump. So it's not a whole lot of money. You're not going to build a wall around the entire island with that. So some countries will be able to deal with it, but the ones who are the most vulnerable really can't do much about it.
They're left with the fewest options.
Yeah, exactly.
They just don't have the financial resources.
Exactly. And, like I said, even if China halves its CO2, and it's not just China, the United States, European Union, India, these large emitters, even if they cut in half their CO2 emissions, which won't happen anytime soon, they're still putting CO2 in the atmosphere, and that's still going to have a warming effect, right? We can debate about to what degree, but it's still going to have a warming effect. So really, there's not a whole lot that can be done short of, shutting off all of progress. So I think what you're going to see is inevitable sea changes, and some of these places, especially the ones that are closest to the sea level, are inevitably going to go under, sadly.
Well, I think that this is a perfect time to bring Grace into the mix to help us find a positive side about the fact that states will no longer exist as we know them.
So on the bright side, we are seeing a number of examples of resilience, both from external actors in the international community and the local countries that are, facing these issues. And so climate change isn't going to be halted immediately. And so for those that are already facing these issues and challenges with rising sea levels, there need to be solutions now, not just looking at reducing carbon emissions and climate change in the future. And so this is creating an opportunity where we're seeing the convergence of both technology and innovation and then space for entrepreneurship. So you have seen, Kevin touched on this earlier, but the MOSE project in Italy. So basically there has been a system of gates constructed, and that's complemented by coastal reinforcements and, paving systems around the lagoon, but is pretty much set up to protect Venice and keep it from flooding. And now, like Kevin was also alluding to earlier, the issue here may not be technology and innovation, but is going to be funding. And so for countries like Bangladesh that don't have the same resources as, wealthier Western countries, but you're still seeing a lot of innovation coming from these communities. One example, you have floating villages in Thailand and floating classrooms in Bangladesh. There is one NGO in Bangladesh that has a system of 20 free floating schools. And, this nonprofit organization is coming in and it has reached almost 70,000 children who otherwise would be unable to make it to school because of the rise in sea level and because their homes have been isolated. So there are a number of, of these positive stories, and the world is full of brilliant, innovative people. The challenge may be money, but, we'll see. I think there's definitely potential to combat this.
Thank you, Grace. That was very bright indeed.
Thank you.
For more information and to see the video and articles we've mentioned, just visit mattersofstate.org/episode 6. Have comments or suggestions? Write to us at facebook.com/mattersofstate. You can also like us or follow us to get updates. Tune in to us next week. Thanks for listening.
The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there.